The extraordinary is the dark, brooding hulk of a ship that lies just off the coast of Western Australia. A wreck unlike any other.
An evil ship. Definitely an evil ship.
The Alkhimos is a ghost ship. It is the day tiny Kim Heaton died in a car crash, and then had her heart started by paramedics, only to lapse into a deep, unending coma.
I had this amazing feeling that Kim was not going to die. I just had it in my own heart that Kim was going to be well.
And the simple act that unlocked the chains on Kim's mind. Chains modern medicine could not break. The extraordinary is the untold story of the late Michael Landon, described by his adopted son, Mark.
He used to play this game like on his birthday, Christmas time, and it's like he'd put his hand over the presents that were wrapped. He would guess what the presents were. I said, Dad, how do you do that? He goes, I get like vibes.
And Michael's story of contact from his own father at the father's funeral. And the bizarre happenings that have plagued some of the most famous names in history. The extraordinary is the litany of disaster that befell the holiday of these two young women, and the twists of fate that kept them alive.
I couldn't believe it had happened to me. I thought it was somebody else.
Just some of the stories that lie beyond our normal understanding. Tonight on The Extraordinary.
More on those two lucky women later. Good evening. I'm Warwick Moss. The West Australian coast is a graveyard for ships. For 3.5 centuries, the craggy rocks have claimed more than their fair share of men and boats. British, French, American, and ships flying a dozen other flags lie in Davy Jones's locker, drawn to their end by a lee shore with few points of shelter. One of the international fleet that visited Australia's west coast and never left was the Alkhimos, a dark, brooding hulk that some say is a ghost ship. A rusting, burnt-out hulk, etched against the evening sky. Once proud, the steamer Alkhimos lies deserted off the Western Australian coast. But there are many who believe that on board there lurks an evil presence. They say the Alkhimos is a ghost ship, a haunted ship that has brought nothing but terror and tragedy to those who've dared venture onto it.
I have always described it as being an evil ship. Definitely an evil ship.
And Jack Sue should know. He's one of Australia's most experienced scuba divers, a man who's spent decades investigating the Alkhimos and its ghost, a ghost who goes by the name of Henry. Jack can't be certain, but he estimates that in the last 30 years or so, more than 20 people, directly or indirectly involved with this twisted wreck, have met untimely deaths.
My advice is don't go. Whether they be divers or photographers or whatever. It's not really worth the risk.
For almost 4 centuries, this stretch of water off Western Australia has been a graveyard for ships and their crews. From the galleons of days gone by to the giant oil tankers of today. The Alkhimos joined the long list of casualties on March the 20th, 1963, when she went aground on a voyage from Indonesia. From that day on, there's been calamity after calamity. All attempts to salvage her have failed, and now she sits there with only her ghost for company.
It's created so much unhappiness, so much sickness, so much hardship for people who've gone broke. There just hasn't been any end of it for 27 years.
This is no place for anyone with a weak heart.
That diary entry was written by a young American exchange student who took what he thought was a cushy part-time job as caretaker on the Alkhimos. The diary convinced Jack Sue that there was more to this ship than meets the eye.
And he got such a hell of a fright, he dropped the torch, dropped the book, and he just fled in the opposite direction. Willy-nilly, he had no idea where he was going, but finished up down in the engine room and eventually found his way back to his cabin. But he said he vowed and declared then he would never go out at night again out of his cabin.
The noises went on and on. The young American became more and more frantic. Finally, he could take no more. He left this cursed ship and was admitted to hospital, a psychiatric hospital. Henry the Ghost had claimed his first caretaker. After studying the diary, Jack Sue knew he had to see and hear what was going on for himself. He joined up with sound recordist Graham Greenwood, and one night, against their better judgment, they tried to record the noises that had driven the American to the brink of madness.
When we eliminated things like the sea and noises like that, there were almost yells and screams. And that particular night, the sea was like a mill pond, so it wasn't the sea. I wasn't a superstitious man, but when I heard the tape the next day, I was very, very glad to get off that Alkhimos. I just don't want to go back on it again.
Graham Greenwood's fears of the Alkhimos linger to this day. Fears that are shared by his mate, Jack Sue.
While I was lying there, I suddenly heard somebody, a sort of a moan coming from the bunk behind me. A sound like somebody rolling over in their sleep, sort of, and I pricked my ears up. I thought I must have been hearing things. So I listened again, and sure enough, it came a second time. And I can tell you I wasted no time getting out of that cabin because I wasn't imagining things.
For a time, the owners of the Alkhimos employed Filipino watchmen, but they didn't last long. Again, the footsteps echoed through the night. Doors opened and closed of their own accord. Tools and equipment simply disappeared. After that, there was a young married couple who took up the challenge. She was pregnant, and heartbreaking tragedy was just around the corner. Perhaps it was Henry. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. But one night during a gale, the woman suffered a bad fall on board. The beginning of yet another disastrous episode on the Alkhimos. For hours, she lay there injured, in agony, with the baby due at any moment. On shore, the rescue operation was underway, a rescue that couldn't come too soon.
They eventually had to get four-wheel drives along to the beach, ambulance, police officers and other emergency crews, and they finally used a rocket to fire a line across from the beach and rig up a line along which they brought the woman off in a bosun's chair. She was then taken to hospital, of course, but she miscarried, and a premature dead baby was the result. So someone had picked it, caught it at the other end, and hurled it back, and it hit him right in the middle of the forehead. And he had to be carted off to hospital to have stitches inserted, and wasn't a very, very well man, so he never got the opportunity to, I don't think he made any attempt to exorcise the ghost. And to the best of my knowledge, never went back on the ship again.
In Western Australia, the Alkhimos and its ghost achieved a degree of fame. Or was it infamy? There were staunch believers, and even stauncher disbelievers, anxious to prove or disprove the legend. One of the skeptics was Perth radio announcer Ted Bull.
Back in 1990, I thought, why don't I do something different for Halloween? And I looked around for ghost stories, for spooky houses and haunted things, and the thing that jumped out at me, of course, was the ghost ship, the Alkhimos.
Technically, everything was in order. Tests had proved beyond doubt there'd been no problems broadcasting from alongside the Alkhimos that Halloween. Maybe Ted Bull's jokey theme music was tempting fate, tempting Henry. But as you'll hear from an actual tape of the show, things started to go wrong. Things the technicians back on shore could not explain.
I think it's amazing. Several times when we've mentioned Henry this morning, we've been cut off.
And then when we actually swung around the boat, I thought, oh, we might lose the program because of technical reasons. It was explained to me, no, that couldn't happen. And it did. As we went around the Alkhimos. And it wasn't like we'd go off and stay off. It was intermittent. It would go off and then come back on. And as I said, every time we mentioned Henry that would happen.
It's almost 4 years since that abandoned broadcast. And now the Alkhimos is disintegrating and deserted.
We've all seen that the ship is just about ready to collapse. I think it'll be lucky to see another winter out. It's all perforated right along the waterline now, and once that goes, the rest of it will just drop.
And for those who've survived the Alkhimos and the ghostly watchman who walks her decks, that day cannot come quickly enough. The sooner the battered steamer goes to her watery grave, the better.
Medical science has made wondrous leaps in the 20th century. Cures have been found for major disease. Science has tinkered with the secrets of life. Once common killers have been rendered harmless. But in all the advances and in all the laboratories, doctors have been unable to unlock the marvel of the human mind and its apparent limitless power. One case that still has doctors baffled is that of Australian girl Kim Heaton.
A little girl lies in a hospital bed unconscious, the victim of a serious road accident. For weeks, her life and the whole world pass her by. But an old friend is about to intervene. And with the help of a ginger kitten, she'll work what some say is a miracle. One morning in November 1971, Pat Heaton was driving her children to school on Sydney's northern beaches. 7-year-old Kim was in the back seat. Out of nowhere, an ambulance appeared. There was a crash.
And when the ambulance hit, her head flicked back and hit her on the base of the skull, and that is where all the damage came from.
Kim Heaton had suffered head injuries. She was unconscious, and the situation looked very grim indeed.
They had to give her external heart massage, so I was told later that she had died on the spot.
Kim Heaton was clinging to life by a thread. Ambulance paramedics had brought her back to life, but there were great fears that she would never fully recover.
Not once, though, did her mother give up hope. And neither did her scripture teacher, Marvit Bainan, who heard the tragic news at school later that morning.
I had this amazing feeling that Kim was not going to die. I just had it in my own heart that Kim was going to be well.
And as Kim was rushed into intensive care, there was the first of many mysterious events. At that very moment, her grandmother was out driving on her way to do the shopping. She had no idea what had happened.
Mum died a couple of years ago, but she always just said, I felt I had to come home. I could just feel something. She didn't say it was bad. She just felt she was needed to be home to answer the phone when it rang. And she got home just in time.
6 weeks later, Kim was still in a coma. Doctors said she may never walk or talk again. Her vital signs were strong, but she remained locked in a dreamlike state.
The doctor did say that she'd never be well enough to come home, that she might have to go to a disadvantaged children's home and learn all the things as much as they could from there, because that they said they just didn't know how she'd be when she'd wake up, if she woke up.
Back at her school, Kim's classmates were shocked. But, organised by Marvit Bainan, they began a vigil, praying for her recovery. And Marvit maintained a vigil of her own, at the little girl's bedside.
The grandma was sitting outside, and I said, has Kim started to speak yet? And she said, no. They said, she'll never talk again. And I said, well, I don't believe that. I just believe that something miraculous is going to happen to Kim, and I just held on to that strong faith.
That particular day, Marvit brought flowers, as usual, and a small gift for her unconscious student. Earlier, she'd been in the city, and for no particular reason, glanced into a shop window. There, she noticed a get well card with a cute ginger kitten on the cover. Somehow, the kitten reminded Marvit of Kim.
Look what I got for you today, Kim. A little ginger pussy cat, because it reminded me of you.
And of course, when she saw the picture of the kitten, she was very excited about it, and she put out her little hands, took it, and just hugged it. Oh, I was so excited about that. Anyhow, I went out and I spoke to her grandma. I said, you said you couldn't speak. I said, you come in here. So anyhow, the grandmother came in, and I said, Kimmy, I said, do you know who this is? And she said, yes, it's my Nana.
From that moment, Kim began to improve slowly, but the doctors were still pessimistic. Then there was another breakthrough, and Marvit Bainan was on hand to witness it.
This particular day when I went in there, the sisters had just taken Kim out of bed, and she said, we're going to teach Kim to walk. And for some reason I got over near the door and I just said, let her go. And I can't remember whether the sisters walked beside her. All I know was I had my eyes on Kim, and I said, now Kim, you walk to me, and she walked.
Chance plays a part in every life. Sometimes it brings good luck, other times bad. Over the years, it probably evens out so that we get our share of each. But there are times when the balance seems tilted very much one way. Take the case of two Sydney women who went on a dream holiday that became a nightmare.
Okay, I'll see you at 7 o'clock at the airport. Bye.
The delay was only for a few hours, but it was enough to throw their schedule into disarray and spoil their stopover in New York.
The wonders of Europe were just ahead, so Tracy and Carolyn decided to forget the past and concentrate on the future. They were booked on a flight from New York to Paris. The date was December the 21st, 1988. The flight was Pan Am 103. With this departure, there were no delays, no problems. They arrived safely in Paris. The European leg of the holiday was underway. Tracy and Carolyn were blissfully unaware of the horror ahead for Pan Am Flight 103.
Tracy was driving and I was playing with the radio, and most of the news was in German. We were actually in Germany when that happened, and I heard this part. I heard Lockerbie and I heard our flight number. So I really couldn't make head nor tail at that stage of what was happening, but I knew there was a problem, but I didn't know that people had died.
Early on the morning of December the 22nd, 1988, the Pan Am jumbo jet was ripped apart by a bomb as it flew from Frankfurt to New York. The fireball that was Flight 103 crashed into the Scottish town of Lockerbie. All 259 passengers on board and 11 people on the ground perished in the explosion and the inferno that followed. Tracy and Carolyn had left the flight only a few hours earlier. A few hours that saved their lives.
We were very relieved to find out that we'd actually gotten there safely and nothing had happened to us at all.
But there was to be an even more remarkable escape, one that will remain with them forever. Tracy and Carolyn were about to make their way home on a journey that would take them across the United States to Honolulu, where they were to link up with their flight that was due to take them to Sydney. United Airlines Flight 811, which today sounds almost as ominous as Pan Am 103.
About 20 minutes out from takeoff, there was this loud noise, and I just opened my eyes because I was laying back ready to go to sleep to see overhead lockers, the interior wall, insulation just being sucked out through a hole.
Initially I thought it was a bomb, and I just remember I couldn't hear much. I was deafened by the noise.
At 27,000 feet above the Pacific, the fuselage of the Boeing 747 tore apart. 9 passengers in business class were ripped from their seats and sucked into the unknown by the jet stream. Tracy McGregor and Carolyn Austin were across the aisle, a few rows back in economy, seats 17A and B.
I was very scared and I wasn't very calm. I wasn't thinking. I just blanked out totally. I really didn't know what I was doing or saying. I remember finding it hard to breathe.
We had a steward come and sit down behind us. It seemed like a long time after the explosion, but it probably wasn't. He sat down and just said, well, this is it. So we thought, well, this was it.
The miracle of Flight 811 was twofold. Firstly, that only 9 of the 336 passengers disappeared through that gaping hole, which was big enough to drive a truck through. Secondly, that the crew were able to pilot the stricken aircraft back to Honolulu.
Once we landed and we were safe, we were shuttled back to the terminal, and the very first thing I did was phone home to inform my mother that I was safe, and after hearing her voice I actually got upset and started to cry then. But other than that, I was all right.
There was to be yet another problem. After the Lockerbie disaster and the United Airlines horror, all Tracy and Carolyn wanted was to go home. But the only flight available was another United aircraft, and it was a rough ride home.
I remember the turbulence coming into Sydney, and that was quite bad, and I remember just putting my head in my lap and waiting until we got on the tarmac. When I got off the plane, I remember running through every station at customs to get out. I just didn't want to be near planes or airport.
But there was one more episode, one I didn't tell you about. At one stage during that disastrous journey, Carolyn broke a mirror. Just a small one she kept in a handbag. Surely that didn't mean... No, it couldn't. Or could it? When Hollywood's favourite son, Michael Landon, died several years ago, he left behind a legacy of courage and goodwill that endures to this day for millions of the world's television viewers. He also left behind an extended family of 9 children who knew the private strengths of their father. We were lucky enough to be given a glimpse into that private world through one of Michael Landon's sons. From little Joe Cartwright on the Ponderosa Ranch in the TV series Bonanza, to Angel Jonathan Smith in the hit series Highway to Heaven 30 years later, Michael Landon knew about fighting the odds. His final challenge would take place as a real-life drama before a national TV audience when he learned he was dying of cancer in 1991.
I think every moment just gets a little more important after something like this.
Though he would finally succumb to fate, Landon did it in a style that was vividly familiar to this man, Mark Landon, the son Michael adopted when he was 12 years old.
Life is about how you handle what's thrown at you. And what he wanted everybody to do is to learn to handle what comes your way. You seize life. You take it on, and you approach it, you make the best of every situation you can.
Mark Landon recalls the father who took him in with the love and fondness of a young boy describing his hero.
Dad always had a wild, wacky sense of humor. When I was a kid and I first met him, we were like 2 cartoon characters. And we both laughed a lot of that laughter.
In some ways, Michael Landon was more than human to the family he left behind. He was a Superman with powers they couldn't explain. Even at a family gathering like Christmas, he seemed to know things nobody else did.
We used to play this game like on his birthday and Christmas time, and it's like he'd put his hand over the presents that were wrapped. I'd bring a present, thousands of presents. I mean, he would get like 9, 10, 11, 12. Perfect. He would guess what the presents were. I said, Dad, how do you do that? And he goes, I get like vibes. He put his hand over the presents, like a few inches off. No cheating. And I mean, this is for real. I remember, like, Mike Jr. saw him do this, and he kind of went... I mean, like, it was really... This makes you start thinking maybe there's some truth to this stuff. Because when it's that consistent, I mean, like 10 in a row...
Wherever Michael is today, Mark believes he is exploring.
I think he'd be flying around exploring other planets right now. Because he loved more information. Loved to read. Loved to, like, absorb scientific information. So I figure, yeah, he'd be flying between the galaxies, looking at other planets and other civilizations. So he loved it.
And Mark is not certain, but he believes he may have had a visit from Michael since the star's death.
I was in my bedroom, and my window was open, and I sort of had this vision with my eyes closed of him flying up to my window with like 3 or 4 kids. And I said, Dad, how you doing? He would, not now, I got work to do. Like he was holding orphans. And then he just flew away. And I sort of opened my eyes and went, nah. But, I mean, how can I be sure I'm really seeing something like that? It's just, it's a vision that's based on his personality and the way he was.
He'll never know if Michael did come back to visit, but Mark does know that Michael believed his own father had reached him from the afterlife.
He was talking about, like, at the funeral, it's like he felt a presence, but he couldn't really be sure. But yeah, it felt like his father was there. And it's like he felt like maybe a hand did tap him. Maybe he did. He couldn't nail it down. And he felt like an ambience of, it's all right, I'm all right, and everything's going to be all right.
Dr. Raymond Moody has long been recognised as the world's foremost investigator and author on the subject of near-death experiences and psychic mysteries. In case you thought the world's fascination with the paranormal was a recent trend, listen to Dr. Moody's list of bizarre happenings that affected the lives of some of the most famous names in the history books. The list of historic figures who reported strange experiences of the paranormal kind dates back to ancient Greece. Dr. Raymond Moody, one of the world's leading authorities and investigators of the unexplained, says famous names like Charles Dickens, General George Patton, and Abraham Lincoln documented personal encounters with psychic experiences, premonitions, and apparitions.
Apparitions of the departed are obviously a phenomenon that go very far back in ancient history, and the writings of ancient writers, of course, are full of accounts like these. This is definitely something that still to this day is a very central part of human experience. And we know from numerous studies that have been published in the medical literature over the years that a high percentage of the normal population who've lost someone to death will spontaneously have these experiences within a certain period of time of the death of a loved one.
Moody, a Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Virginia Medical School and Doctor of Medicine at the Medical College of Georgia, is the author of several books on the paranormal and is director of the Theatre of the Mind in Alabama, where he conducts his research. Throw him a famous name, he'll give you the paranormal event of the person's life. How about George Patton?
George Patton was well known as a person who was interested in this kind of phenomenon and had a lot of very interesting paranormal experiences. He relates that in World War II, his father, he said, who had died, would come to him every night in his tent and encourage him and tell him that he would do all right the next day.
How about Charles Dickens?
Dickens was a person who was well known as a person who was gifted with what we call hypnagogic states of awareness. And he used this state of consciousness to get the stories that we all value so highly. He would apparently see the stories unfurling, as it were, before his eyes when he was in the hypnagogic state. Dickens related an interesting experience he had one day when he was walking along the streets of London, and he saw a carriage coming toward him, and very vividly stepped out of the way, and then in turning back around to face it, found that it had disappeared, that there was nothing there before his eyes.
And even the first president of the United States to be assassinated recorded a distinct premonition of his own death, according to Dr. Moody.
On the night of the election of 1860, after Abraham Lincoln had won the election, he was very exhausted, and he sort of collapsed onto a sofa, and he looked up and saw the mirror on the wall. And in the mirror, he saw not one but two images of himself. He saw one image of himself as a very vibrant and lively-looking person, full of life, and another ghostly and pale image, which appeared to be like death-like. He and his wife took this to be an indication that, although he would be elected twice, that he would die in his second term in office, which did, of course, take place.
Lincoln was shot dead by an assassin, John Wilkes Booth, in the balcony of the Ford Theatre on April the 14th, 1865.